Well, thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity to come and address you here today. I suspect that you might not agree with everything that I have to say, but I'm sure we will see eye to eye on a number of things, and in some ways that might surprise those who are here today. I've also lodged a detailed submission, which my remarks today will draw on. But firstly, can I acknowledge the significance of this hearing being held at all? It represents exactly what democracies, including our own, fight to preserve. And I think it's what really lies at the heart of the purpose of AUKUS. Our democratic freedoms, especially our freedom to openly challenge government policies, as significant as its defence policy is. And I can assure you, as we all know, that there is not a single citizen of Russia, China, Iran, or North Korea who could convene a hearing like this being held here today. And in my submission, I'm very clear that my comments about the threat that the world now faces relate to a very small number of ambitious, dangerous, and powerful autocrats and the autocratic regimes that they lead. And what they have in common is that they all hold on to power by silencing, often brutally, silencing dissent. But we here hold ours by consent. And in fact, in politicians, as many here would know, is that we hold power by surviving that dissent in our communities. And that difference is really worth the cost of defending our democratic freedoms. Now, I'm concerned about each of these regimes for what each of them is building, and also now what they are doing increasingly in supporting each other's war efforts. And they are all learning from each other on the battlefield. And just to be very clear, that my concerns are in no way related to their citizens and also their many diaspora all over the world, including here in Australia, who today are our neighbours and our fellow citizens. And in fact, when you talk to some, many of them migrated here to escape the very governments that I'm challenging here today. So at the heart of my submission, my written submission and my comments here today is that my view is that AUKUS is necessary, but it has not yet hit its stride. And it does certainly have some challenges, which I'm sure will be aired today, that must be addressed. I believe that the shortfall in AUKUS is not the partnership itself, but it is in our pace and our current capability priorities, and as I said, not in the partnership itself. While it appears on the face of it that the money for near-term weapons is rising, but far too few of them will be manufactured here in Australia and far too few available for us if we need them. The wars in the Ukraine and the Middle East have shown just how fast these expensive and high-end munitions and defensive systems are spent, and how slowly it takes us to replenish them. That gap between what we are spending at the moment and what we can field is the real gap and the real challenge of AUKUS. But this is a pace that we can and must fix. It is not a reason not to proceed with AUKUS. I actually began the pathway for AUKUS as the Minister for Defence. And I supported it, the concept then, and I absolutely still support it today. And for over a decade, as a very proud senator for the wonderful state of Western Australia, I've argued the strategic importance of our western flank, and I do so again here today and in my submission. And one of the recurring themes of my submission is the true cost of war. I was in Ukraine last year, and I met with many families who had lost their loved ones. I met with many service personnel, and I was just so inspired because they had some concern about whether they could come together as a nation to fight for their democracy, for their culture, for their language, for their religion, and for their sense of identity. And by goodness, they have. But it was also really interesting talking to soldiers from the front, and they had absolutely no doubt they were not just fighting Russia. They were fighting China, North Korea, and also Iran. in terms of the missiles and the troops and the technologies that they had on the battlefield. So my case for AUKUS runs in 5 parts. Firstly, there is no question that the threat today is real, and it's already being seen on 2 battlefronts, global wars. So in relation to China, I don't claim to read Xi Jinping's mind. However, I do read very closely what his regime builds and where it is building. I read its cyber intrusions into the infrastructure here in Australia that runs our power, our water, our communications, our navigation, and in fact runs our lives. I read China's interference into our own communities and to our own democratic debates on the issues that matter. Now, I also do agree that his words can be interpreted, his often veiled words can be interpreted differently, but still wholes cannot be misinterpreted. And the stark fact is that China is in its largest military build-up of any nation since 1945, 31 years now and counting. Today, they have more than 60 submarines, and by 2035, they will have over 80, and almost half of them will be nuclear-propelled and all have nuclear propulsion and have nuclear weapons. So the reality for us, when you strip everything else away, is that we have vast approaches to defend. And we have an adversary, a potential adversary, but a real one, that is increasingly operating not just across the Pacific, but also increasingly now on our flank across the Indian Ocean. And nuclear propulsion, not weapons, buys what diesel electric motors cannot give a continent our size. We need the range to get to where we need to go. We need the endurance to stay there, and we need to be able to do it submerged, because submarines are now the major and only capability that still cannot be detected from anywhere else but subsea. That might change, but at the moment, they are the biggest capability that we have. Secondly, my second point is that deterrence is fundamentally a coalition undertaking. It is not something that we can ever do alone. It's not something we ever have done alone. So not even the United States can work alone to keep our region safe. As I mentioned, these 4 authoritarian states are pooling their strength, and they are learning very, very quickly from each other's wars, and they are implementing those lessons very, very quickly, while we still remain very flat-footed in working out what that means for threat for us and what we then have to do to counter it. So like-minded democracies, our friends like us, must pool their capabilities together, our industries together, and learn the lessons once and share them across all of our nations. But this is not the first time Australia has been in this position. For more than a century, through every major war, we have fought in coalition, and we have deterred as a coalition. And my third argument in support of AUKUS is that history teaches us that AUKUS is the right partnership. It is not the only one. We have many others that have to work together, but AUKUS is the right partnership for us. Democracies have pulled their industrial strength before in response to authoritarian aggression and the war, but it took far too long for them to get mobilised once the Second World War had started. But in the Second World War, these allied partnerships won the war, but it also built the peace that lasted up until this time. And I believe AUKUS is that same partnership, but it's now built for our times. Our allies bring to us not just the submarines, but advanced technologies, enduring industries, and jobs of the future. What we bring to the partnership is not just receiving something from others. We bring something that they do not have, and that's our geography. Our western flank that we look out from, this beautiful part of Western Australia will provide all of our AUKUS partners the ability to project and sustain military power across the Indian Ocean, which we cannot do yet, which they cannot do yet. But this ocean is incredibly important for Australia, and it has been much neglected in our defence capability thinking. 99% of our trade to and from Australia moves across the Indian Ocean, and there are 3 very tight choke points in the Indonesian archipelago that, if were cut, our nation would stop. We couldn't send anything and we couldn't receive anything. Fourthly, and I think something that might be at the top of the mind of the commissioners and also you here today, is that I absolutely believe that AUKUS is strengthening our sovereignty. It doesn't surrender our sovereignty. The fact is that there are no foreign bases on Australian soil, only joint ones. And the access we grant is a deliberate sovereign choice that we deem to be in our interest. And of course, it's a choice that we can always rescind. So let you also like to make the point that AUKUS is delivering Australia sovereign nuclear-powered submarines, not nuclear-armed submarines. Sometimes that difference gets lost in this debate, but it is an incredibly important one. And probably most importantly, the decision if and when to go to war and how we go to war remains a sovereign Australian decision. I believe the real surrender would be for Australia to let the Collins-class submarines age out with nothing sovereign to replace them. And I strongly hold, I know might be contended here, that to meet the threat, the future military capabilities, particularly the submarines, must be nuclear powered. So lastly, my final argument in support of AUKUS is that it's not the plan or the partnership that's a problem. It's currently delivery shortfalls in all 3 nations, but all of those 3 are fixable. Saying that we need the capability and then not funding it is simply spin. It is not the delivery of military capability that can deter an adversary. And this is exactly what we're seeing play out currently in the United Kingdom, and also I argue here in Australia. We're announcing capability acquisitions, but we're not yet funding it in the order and the precedence that we need. Firstly, to Australia. On the most recently published budget figures, Australia's core defence budget is actually going backwards. Strip away the new accounting measures and adding superannuation and other things, veterans' expenditure into the defence budget does not provide us any additional military capability. And the actual fact, in terms of true defence expenditure, we're going from 2.13% of GDP this year to 2.02% next year. And the figures from my perspective get even worse. Of every dollar announced in this budget for the next decade, so this is 10 years of expenditure that have been announced, only 4 cents of that expenditure is in this financial year, when we need it to acquire more capabilities. Excuse me. Yeah. Is this yours? No, it's not mine. Oh. Whoever this is, I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, it's better. So one of the most important things when we're discussing AUKUS is to keep in mind that the new AUKUS class of submarine are a generational build. They are not something that can or should be acquired immediately, and they have a much longer and different funding envelope. But the near-term weapons, the missiles and the defences against missiles and drones are the things that we now need to deliver. And they're the very things that the government is not yet adequately funding in the budget. They've pushed them sort of well out, sometimes past the 10-year mark. But I think even worse for here in Western Australia, our infrastructure that the AUKUS strategy depends on is sitting at round about a tenth of what is actually needed to develop the infrastructure and the industries and the jobs that AUKUS will demand. Now to the UK. The UK's current struggle with defence spending, which has been very widely reported and has just cost the Prime Minister his job, and including 2 defence secretaries. It's not an argument, in my mind, against our partnership. It's a function that we often experience here of the messiness sometimes of democracy. There is a delivery gap, and there's also a delivery gap currently with the United States and submarines. But that is not an argument to proceed with the partnership. It is an argument to get the planning right, to spend what needs to be spent, and actually implement the plan. Now, just briefly, can I turn to nuclear waste, which is something I know is very keenly interesting to the Commission. I look at it this way. For over 60 years, we have generated our own low and medium level waste. And for 60 years, we've avoided having to deal with our own waste. The waste that we generate is already real. Currently, it's stored in around about 100 locations around our nation, and we send it to other people's countries to deal with it for ourselves. And I very much hope that AUKUS will finally force us to deal with our own waste. And the most important thing is that it has to be done very differently from how we've dealt with nuclear testing and how we've dealt with things in the past. It has to be done with genuine community consent and transparency publicly. In relation to the costs, one of the figures you'll probably hear cited here today, and I'm sure the inquiry has heard, is $368 billion by the mid-2050s for AUKUS, and in particular the submarines. But quoting that figure alone is quite misleading, because the figure is actually set at a ceiling, and there's a 50% buffer in there already for changes, contingency, and additional capabilities. So the true cost today is about half of that. But the most salutary thing for me, and certainly when I was Minister for Defence, was how do we keep our nation safe? Because with the development of infrastructure, artificial intelligence, with the lethality of conventional and nuclear weapons exponentially growing, and the new threats from space, from cyber, the cost of any future war, which is already upon a number of other nations, is the true cost that we must measure the cost of AUKUS against. I've got a number of recommendations, and I think probably my time is about up in my submission. So in conclusion, Chair, critique alone, and there's been a lot of critique in this committee, and I think that's a fantastic thing to happen. But critique alone will not prevent a war. And it's far easier to default a program as large as AUKUS and call for a plan B. But saying you need a plan B when you don't actually suggest what that plan B might be is very hollow. And I have not yet seen anybody who's put forward a credible plan B for AUKUS. To abandon AUKUS over a delivery shortfall would be akin to an answer to a leaky roof being to sell the house itself. And that's how I see AUKUS. We have to deliver it, but we have to deliver it faster, and we need new priorities. So thank you very much, Chair, and I look forward to your questions.
Oh, thanks very much, Linda. And we do, and we do very much value hearing from someone who has worked at that level. You're absolutely right. We do have some time constraints here, and I do apologise in advance to others that are presenting. I think we want to take this opportunity, given former Senator Reynolds' expertise, to have sufficient time for questions, but I'll ask my commissioners to take it one at a time and in turn, and I might start with Chris Barrett. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. In 2004-2010, Paul Barrett and I were chasing a nuclear-powered submarine for Australia, and we hit a brick wall in Washington, DC, and couldn't go no further. But our proposal was built on the back of a nuclear power industry in Australia to support smart buying and to provide proper career paths for nuclear engineers. And I guess that's one of the big failures I see in the current proposal, which is we're going to do this without that smart buying and pathways for engineers that we had proposed.
Just for a little bit of history, I know exactly what you're talking about. So when I became minister in 2019, I inherited the French submarine deal from my predecessor. And at the time, that was the best option that had been assessed as available, best conventional option, because the United States had only ever given their crown jewels, nuclear propulsion, to one nation, that was the UK. But shortly after inheriting this program and working deeply into the program, there were a number of very significant structural flaws in the contract. It was running over time, the project planning was behind, and the cost was increasing exponentially. So that's when it was again Scott Morrison and I at the time, started saying, well, what if? Because clearly having a look at the threat, we needed nuclear propulsion. So that's when we started off with a plan B. And that then continued on after I was no longer minister. And that was one of the things that we considered. And there's two answers directly to that. First of all is we're getting a modularised reactor that essentially plugs and plays into the submarines we build here. And they're maintained by US and UK staff who will be based here at Henderson and also at Stirling. But one of the biggest benefits that I address in my submarine is the fact that we will be transferring that industrial knowledge, the technical know-how, to Australia. We've already got universities here who've got new courses in the nuclear field for engineers. There's new trades. South Metro TAFE here is fantastic, and they're doing a great job opening these opportunities up. Now, we've got a long way to go on the nuclear power generation issue for nuclear energy here in Australia, but this does open the door. So we've got submariners. By the end of this year, we'll have submariners on every single US Virginia-class submarine on active duty. They're topping the courses in the colleges now, and they are getting that real-time experience in all of the trades. So we are bringing that sovereign capability back to Australia. So it will be Australians who, when we get the three Virginias, whatever schedule we land on, but they will be crewed by Australians. They'll be maintained by Australians. So we are opening into that industry here, which can then grow if we do go into nuclear energy here at some point.
Thanks, Linda. Leanne.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I've just got two very quick questions. I've heard from the Deputy Prime Minister Miles at a speech a few weeks ago at the War Memorial that a direct threat from Australia wouldn't necessarily be troops landing here. And you said yourself just then that there's, community interference, there's cyber strikes. And I take your point that nobody's put forward an AUKUS plan B. But what I'm hearing from you and others, it feels like we need an AUKUS, from your perspective, we need an AUKUS plus. So if we want an AUKUS plus, could you spend just a minute talking about what you think the plus is? And if 2.02% of our GDP isn't enough for defence spending, what would you see as an adequate spend?
I'll answer that one first. I think I said in the submission that I think the new NATO 3.5% target is the right one for us, but that should be a floor, not a ceiling. But again, like everything, defence is resplendent. in its ability to mismanage projects and to waste money. And that sadly continues today. So we also have to get serious about making sure that the capability we need now is delivered and that we get value for money. So I think there's two answers to that. So the second one, I think, is correct. So when people ask me, well, can we prevent war? That's actually the wrong question. We've actually been at war with that bloc, and particularly with China, since before I was minister. Now, that's not kinetic war, and I can see some of you shaking your heads, but it is what's called hybrid and Grayzone war. So they're persistent, hundreds, thousands of attacks on our infrastructure. So for our critical industries, our big companies, our Defence Department, our government agencies, Centrelink, Services Australia, they are mostly, some of them are criminals, but they are also not just China, but predominantly China. And there is nothing benign about that. But not only do they attack to interfere, they also put malware on the software, which actually then maps our systems so that they can work out how to turn the systems off. It's very well reported. ASIO boss this week also, so if you have a look online, Mike Burgess was talking specifically about the threat that the Americans have identified, which we also now have in some of our critical infrastructure here. But it's also space. I created Space Command and Cyber Command as minister because they're going to be our two, if they can turn, which arguably they can, if they can turn our power off, they can turn our navigation off, they can interfere, if not destroy our communication satellites, our nation stops. Our nation stops. So those are the attacks that will increase first if we have a war in our region, in the South China Sea. But and I totally agree with Richard, the next step of that would be surgical strikes on our defence installations here and up in the northwest, probably is the most likely ones to start with. So, and we have no defences to those at the moment. We don't. And that is one of the biggest issues we now have to address.
Thanks, Linda. Carmen?
Look, just a very blunt and brutal question, really, Linda, following from what you just said. You heard the arguments that the presence of US submarines makes the Stirling base, the Henderson precinct, a possible target in the event of armed conflict involving the United States. Do you agree with that proposition?
Yes, I do, but that's not a recent development. As soon as we built Stirling, HMAS Stirling, it became a target. And Henderson now increasingly, because we've got the naval shipbuilders there, and we'll have more industry there. So absolutely, but that is not a new occurrence.
And I just a quick follow-up. Do you think we've made adequate preparation for such an eventuality?
No. I've been very critical for a long time, in fact, for over 10 years, well before AUKUS as a WA senator. And this is the state government of both colours. So this predates, the current Labor state government. We have not taken this issue seriously. And I know I think somebody who's going to present here today is talking about emergency response. But it's much, much further than that. It is all fixable, but we have to take the threat seriously and we have to implement all of those things you'll hear about today.
Okay, thanks. So just time for a little bit more. You will seek your indulgence, members of the public, because it's not often that we do have a former Defence Minister and the opportunity to ask those questions. So I think we will give ourselves a little bit more legacy here, Chris.
Hugh White, of course, has a proposition that we got to get used to living with China. And I think you can build a respectable argument that says we don't take into account the penetration of the United States and Australia like we do penetration of China into Australia as being a serious attack. And yet, time after time, we do read about what multinational companies based in the United States are doing in this country. So do you see a future in which Australia's got to come accommodation with China now as a dominant power in this region?
I'm going to be a complete politician and say yes and no, but I'll explain why. So first of all, I don't think you can compare the two, and I have an enormous amount of respect for Hugh White, but we do not agree at all on this position. I very much see that autocrats and authoritarian regimes respect strength, and they see weakness in our countries as something to exploit. And that is a fundamental difference between them and and our other allies. And it's not just that, the difference goes a lot further, is those four nations, they don't respect human rights. They are now in those two, the wars in Ukraine and also in the Middle East, they use their own people as cannon fodder, and they accept casualties, and nearly 1.5 million in Putin's war against Ukraine. And the list goes on and on and on. So I think they're very, very different propositions, and I don't see anything benign in China's intent. Now, they most likely won't have to physically invade, storm the beaches of Australia, but they don't need to anymore to neutralise us. So I think, so that's the no, I don't agree with him, but the yes, I do agree with him in that we need to look to the past. And I think World War II is probably the best analogy we have at the moment. Appeasing autocrats and dictators does not work, and it inevitably leads to war. So for me, it's all about how do we come to an accommodation with China? Again, it's the regime, not its people, to deter war and to bring them back into rules-based order, which they just see it as something to get around.
Thanks for that. And Leanne, just one quick one.
Yeah, I'm going to follow on from that around sovereignty, because I think that a lot of people have expressed concern around sovereignty issues, especially when dealing with the US and the fact that the US has fundamentally changed. So it's not just a moment that we have somebody a bit unhinged. President Trump has a strange way. It's that the country has, and we've also heard on the record now a couple of times that even when we were working with the US in the first Gulf War, they told our ministers at the time to go away, but in much more colourful language, and that they were running the war, and they told our people where to go. So how do you see it? How do we protect our sovereignty and then create this sort of partnership that you referred to as being great because that's what it was like post World War II? I think it's a different world. How do you see it?
I don't think it is that different. And when you have a look at the analogy, human nature doesn't change. And the nature of authoritarian states and behaviours and, the beautiful messiness of democracy doesn't change. But what does change is leadership. And what I saw time and time again is two things. First of all, it is a complete fallacy to say that we can uncouple from the United States in terms of our military capability. All of our advanced systems, our weapons, our capabilities are all completely seamlessly integrated with the United systems. They're interoperable, is what it's called. So even if we wanted to tomorrow, we couldn't. And nor should we want to. But what I think at the heart of your question is how, as leaders, do we stand up and actually say, no, this is our land? Well, you might want to tell us that, but on your bike. We are going to withdraw our troops. We are going to not do this. Now, I don't agree with the decision in terms of Iran and sending more equipment over there, but this government did that. They said to the US, no. And they bleated a bit, but moved on. And it hasn't harmed our relationship. So it comes down to our own leadership, I think, and what we're willing to stand up on behalf of Australians.
So look, thanks very much. And I suppose just to seek your indulgence with one final question, it's of a more general nature. But I picked up on your remarks about Australians' sovereign decision-making and that being effectively in the hands of the people. I'm not trying to misrepresent you at all, Linda. What is your thoughts now after your time in Parliament as to whether or not the Parliament itself should either be consulted or have the opportunity to debate decisions in relation to going to war?
That's a really good question, and it's something that I've reflected on very deeply for obvious reasons. I think that two things. First of all, is that the blurring, our constitutional blurring between the role of a parliamentarian and executive government is very blurred. And when you, like I was, and many of us have been, you've actually got two constitutional roles, and it's very tempting to allow the executive government, when you're in power, all sides, to dominate the parliament and to reduce the power of the parliament. And I think that's happening again. That now, where I draw the line is I think that Parliament must be able to use Senate estimates and other committees far more effectively and far, as I've said in my submission, far more transparently. But I don't believe that the decision to go to war should be a decision for the Parliament itself, because the answer would never be yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, please join the commission. Thank you, Reynolds, very much.
Thank